Welcome to Bible study, everybody. It's 9:17, so I think there are probably some people watching at home. So let's get going this morning. We've got a little less than 45 minutes today to talk more about how we as Christians live in both kingdoms, being in God's kingdom of faith and in the world that we live in too. Like usual, handouts are up on the stand if you'd like. Otherwise, most of it's on the screen as well. Let's begin this morning with a prayer. Lord, I thank you today that you have brought us into your family, that even though we were far away from you, your son Jesus has brought us near to you by his blood shed on the cross. So I pray today that you'd help us as we live in that other kingdom too, the kingdom of this world, which you promised to bless us through as well. And I pray today that you'd give us wisdom to know what to do and what to say, how to act as we live in both of those kingdoms. Amen. So this is the one that wraps it up, although in a way I don't know that there's a way to just say we covered everything that you could have talked about on this topic. At the end, the question will be to ask you kind of what are some takeaways you had. I found for myself that every time I go through and look at a topic again, there are always a couple things that I add that I probably hadn't thought about before. And then if I come back to that again in a couple of years, it's like, oh, now I can build on what I had from before. So just for you, if this wasn't your first time, what was something that you took away from this time, these weeks, looking at it again? If it was the first time, what was something that just struck you? So think about that for the end. The opening question today is, if you'd give somebody some good principles about how to be a Christian serving in a position in a government, what are some things you'd say to them? Actually, after worship last night, there was somebody who stopped by who's planning to be a candidate for the Senate seat that's open now with Fitzgerald heading to D.C. And he and I talked after worship a little bit last night. And whether it be someone like him or I don't know who else you'd have in mind, but what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's a Christian who's going to also be serving in a position of power in the government? This is kind of planting a seed because we're going to look at Nehemiah this morning. So I might come back to this question later on after you've thought about it some more, but just right off the bat, what's something that you would say to them, Marie?
First of all, check with the Ten Commandments and see what God says about many issues.
So Marie's first comment would be, think of what you know about what God says. The Ten Commandments is a good summary of what God's will is. To have your own compass as a Christian, to know what God says in his word to you. Other thing about the Ten Commandments, the first ones are about our relationship with God, but especially 4 through 10, they really hit on things that are part of the natural knowledge of God. So should people know in general you don't kill other people? Yeah. So are the Ten Commandments revealed from God on Mount Sinai? They were, but in a way those are things that people already have a sense of with the natural knowledge of God. And so if you're working in the government, people who are not Christians, I'd expect that there should be a pretty good degree of overlap on especially Commandments 4 through 10, that you need to honor and respect those who are in authority, to not murder. There needs to be some kind of standard of sexual morality in marriage. 7th commandment is about not stealing. 8th commandment is how you talk about other people. 9th and 10th, they're a little bit, it's hard. How do you have laws about coveting in the heart, about being content with your life? But I think if a Christian would talk about those kind of things, that's not only something that a Christian will believe, you'll find an overlap with others too. So that's Marie's first piece of advice. Anybody else want to jump in right away, or should we go to Nehemiah and then come back to that one? Wendy.
Just be strong in your convictions and stand up and be confident to vote for what's right. Maybe it's not necessarily popular, but to be strong in your convictions.
Yeah, do Christians somehow have to be timid as they lead? No. Not that we just shut everybody else down and say, I'm right and you're wrong all the time, but to be confident in what we believe and in how you would lead if you're in a position like that. Glenn.
I would say my dad being an alderman in the city opposition, and you have to stand strong in your faith in God. And because he supported Christian education, there were conversations that he had, and he set the goals of why he was sending his kids to Christian schools. And when he made that known, I think that they realized how he felt about Christian education, that he wasn't not supporting public education because he paid for both. And so I think when he brought that out, I think that kind of, they stepped away from him, criticizing him a lot. So you're going to take a lot of heat.
So for those who couldn't hear that, Glenn gave an example from his dad's life being an alderman in Milwaukee of sometimes you just stand up. So the example was pressure to want your kids in the public school when he wanted his kids to have a Christian education, and to be able to stand firm and explain, here's why I want my children to have a Christian education, and that's okay for me to be an alderman and have my kids go to a Lutheran school. Right? Yeah, and I think along with that is just, we got to prove as Christians that we can be good leaders too. That, yeah, you can send your kids to a Lutheran school and still be a respected community member who does a great job leading the community. That those are not somehow opposites, or it has to be one or the other. That I hope one thing that you take away from these weeks is a Christian really is living in both. We are not called to just spend all our time together in the church and forget about what's happening in our world. And if you do jump into a position of leadership in the government, whether local or national, that doesn't mean you leave your church behind. It's God has called us to be part of both of those kingdoms at the same time. And how do you live in both at the same time can be hard. Let's come back to this question after we look at Nehemiah. So again, it's not like we can talk about everything that could possibly be said. Even the book of Nehemiah, we're just going to jump around and look at a couple things that happened in his life. Wouldn't be a bad thing if you would just read through all of Nehemiah and see some of the things that he wrestled with as a leader. So the setting is, this is after the people were taken into captivity in Babylon. And then they came back, but Nehemiah is not in the first generations. And I should have checked this again. He's something like 100 years after that initial wave of people came back. And so he comes back because he hears that even after such a long period of time, things really haven't been rebuilt, especially the walls around Jerusalem. And he has a heart for saying, God's people need some leadership over in Jerusalem. So then he asks the government in Persia to allow him a leave of absence to go and serve as the leader over in Jerusalem. Now, I was sitting where you were when Pastor Tom Have taught about this in December, and I couldn't remember exactly where we ended. So if you could help me out with this, did we read Nehemiah chapter 1, that section? My memory is we did. Am I right on that? Or you're like me, like a month goes by and might as well just refresh it all because I don't know that I remember everything from before Christmas. Let me go through the first parts a little more quickly. So if you've got a paper copy, there are 4 sections from Nehemiah that hopefully we'll have time to look at this morning. With 45 minutes, it's not going to be in-depth on all of them, but to give you 4 snapshots from his life, each of them showing you an aspect of what for him it was like to be a leader who had his faith and leading in Jerusalem at this time. So, from chapter 1, here's verses 1 through 11. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. So Susa is over where Iran would be today. This is the headquarters of the Persian Empire. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. So if we stop there, what's the big problem in the opening chapter of Nehemiah? Jerusalem's a mess. He hears about this. If I'd go back to that opening question, what's something you could take out of these verses of what's a characteristic in Nehemiah you could say, this is what you'd hope to see in a leader? Jill?
Cares about his people.
Isn't that true? And you'd hope that'd be true not just of Christians as well, but if you give advice to somebody who's going to be the government, I hope you're doing this because you care about people. I don't get the sense from Nehemiah that he was on some kind of power trip or just was doing it because this was his career path and he loved being in control. You see throughout that he has a real heart for God's people, and his faith is connected with that, not in some kind of outward or hypocritical way, but he very much, his faith is part of the way that he cares for people. I mean, would you weep at the thought of walls being broken down? I don't know that all that many people would. But he cares about his people that much. And I guess another characteristic, I think we touched on this last time, was the way that the first thing he does is to come before God in prayer about it. He's going to make his own plans. It's not like he sits back and does nothing. But you have a leader who is going to take the care of the people before God in prayer, even confessing the sins of the people. That's what you see right away off the bat in Nehemiah chapter 1. Next verses. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeem by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. So what was the first thing he did? We talked about that. What a beautiful prayer. Confessing sin, and I just love how he holds on to the promise of God. God, you told us you were going to exile us if we rebelled against you, but I remember you promised that you would bring us back. And so it's a prayer that holds on to the promises of God. Related passage then is from 1 Timothy chapter 2. The Apostle Paul says, I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. So on the left side, what kind of prayer agenda might the Christian have who is involved in government or politics? So it'd be a different question, what would you pray for the government? But if you were somebody who was in a position of power in the government, what would you put on your prayer list? Marie?
I think I'd ask for wisdom, just because it's such a confusing.
You say that, I think of Solomon, right?
That's
So
what I was thinking.
Solomon, as a young man, asked for whatever you want. What would you ask for? He asked for a heart that can hear, that's able to listen to God, and that therefore has wisdom in him. God says, I'm glad you asked for that to ask God for wisdom in carrying out your responsibilities. Keep going. What else would you put on a prayer list if you were in that position? Kyle. Patience. Give me patience. And I'm not in the government, but as a pastor, the Christian church is almost all dealing with people. At the seminary, there's a saying, the best thing about pastoral ministry is the people. And the worst thing about pastoral ministry is the people. And that is very true. And I don't think I realized coming out of seminary I was naive to how much interpersonal conflict there is among people in this world, in the Christian church and in government. So to pray that God would give you the kind of spirit that can be patient with other people, that'd be definitely something to pray for. Matt.
God use you to do his will, not you use him to do your will.
Yep, that God would use you. Not that you use God the other way around. Well said. Glenn, were you going to add one too?
I was just going to say, with that being said, that to give you the strength. It's be a tough road.
Yep, the strength to go on. I keep thinking of pastor things I've heard, but again, I think leading people, there are some things that are the same. One of my friends, he likes to quote this proverb: to be a pastor, you need the mind of a scholar, the heart of a child, and the hide of a rhino, is the one that he's heard. And I think for someone who's leading people in the government, to have that kind of strength and resilience to keep going even when it's hard, that's something you need. Jeremiah, one of the promises God made to him as a prophet is, I will make you a bronze wall against the people. That there's a certain strength you need from someone who's in a position of leadership. Again, you could apply that to someone like a prophet or a pastor in a church. But if you're thinking, what does Nehemiah need, or what does a leader today need who's a Christian serving a country, it'd be things like that. Let's keep going. So the next section. So after praying to God, again, it's not that he just sits around and does nothing. I think that's a balance we need from those in leadership too, is to know when to be still and just trust God, and when to know it's time that we act and God works through our actions. Both of those are true. And so here, chapter 2 now, Nehemiah takes action. Here's verses 1 through 5. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Question on the left is, Nehemiah went before King Artaxerxes. What is obvious about his relationship to the king, and why should that not surprise us? Wendy.
He had a close relationship that the king would notice his feelings and his facial expressions.
He would, and you get the sense Nehemiah is not the kind of, he's not the kind of guy who's going to be crabby and complaining all the time, and when something's wrong, all of a sudden that's different about him. I don't know that it looks like they're best buddies, but does he have a good relationship with the king? So if I keep adding that list, what kind of advice would you give to a Christian who's going to be serving in a position in the government? It's a good thing to cultivate relationships with other people, and to be on, not that you're going to be best friends or on good terms with everyone, but is it a good thing to get to know the people who are around you that you are serving with? It is. I also just love that chain of events there where he gets really nervous, and who wouldn't, right? And before he answers, he says this little prayer in his heart to God. It doesn't say what that prayer was. You can maybe guess. But again, he's living in a constant conversation with God, and as he's asked this of the king, he says a prayer before. So the quest is, could I go back and rebuild the city of my ancestors? Verses 6 to 9. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy? And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Question, what characteristics do we find in Nehemiah that should be stand as examples for believers who serve in government positions? So kind of same question we've been talking about. What do you see in him there? Jill?
He's respectful. I mean, he has a position, and yet he's talking to someone who is in a position higher than him. He's respectful and not demanding.
Jill said he's respectful, he's not demanding as he makes these requests. Keep going. Kyle.
He recognized the opportunities that God had given him and used them to do God's work.
He saw this as an opportunity and he was ready for it. I think it's easy sometimes, you've got this dream, but you don't actually plan out what are the next steps. And yeah, he knows exactly the next things to ask for. So Trans-Euphrates, Euphrates River, Israel would have been on the west side of the Euphrates River, so Trans-Euphrates is the province that Judah is part of. So Nehemiah has thought ahead, if this, he's not sure will happen, but if I'm able to go ahead with this, what do I need next? I need permission from the government in that province, and I'm going to need some supplies. And so even before he's left, he already has secured timber to start his building project, and he's secured letters that will introduce him to the government there and give him authority from the Persian government over in Susa. So to say to someone who's going to be in government, we need you to be somebody who's able to make plans and be responsible at carrying things out. You see that in Nehemiah 2. I'm looking, this note actually, we should come back to that one. That ties in with Nehemiah chapter 6. So, what are we jumping over? In the meantime, then, he travels back. Again, being cupbearer to the king, this was a fairly important position. He's got actually soldiers and cavalry accompanying him all the way back. He's got timber from the forest. He's got letters that give him authority in that province to do these things. So then he goes back and he spends a night, so people don't, he wants to have a plan before he tells everyone what he's there for, so he spends a night traveling around and inspecting the walls for himself. And then comes up with a plan of here's how we're going to rebuild. So jumping ahead to chapter 6, there was opposition from others in the area who didn't want to see the walls rebuilt. So if you want an example of someone who's a believer in God's people who has to be strong and face some opposition, that's what we've got here in Nehemiah chapter 6. So the thing I want you to look for is, what are the different strategies that people are bringing against him and his project, and what's Nehemiah's way of avoiding those? So here's Nehemiah chapter 6. This slide has verses 1 through 5. We got some names there. So these would be other political areas that are around Jerusalem. I'd have to go back and line them up exactly. I think some of these are the Samaritans to the north. There also are people living around, so these are people outside of Judah and their leaders. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, but up to that time I had not set the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to them with this reply: "I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Then the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter, in which was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem: there is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us confer together." I sent him this reply: "Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You're just making it up out of your head." They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, "Now strengthen my hands." Let's stop there. What are the things that Nehemiah finds himself up against from some of these neighboring? So this is all within the Persian Empire. But it's not like everyone is united and playing nice together in the government. So what are they doing against Nehemiah? Joanne. So the second one is just flat out saying, we're going to report a lie about you. And you think that would have been a pretty strong accusation if they would have. So it's an unsealed letter saying, we could mail this. If they had sent that to the Persian government, that is a pretty serious charge that Nehemiah is leading a revolt. What was Nehemiah's response to that one? I'm not even, that's not true. And I don't know, when I as a leader get emails like that, not that exact one, but are there some pretty strong emails I get sometime? Yeah, I lose sleep over those. I don't know how much sleep Nehemiah would have lost over what if they mail that letter. But his response to that one was just, that's not true. I'm just going to keep going on and working. I'm going to ignore that threat. What was the one before? So that was the second one. Now, they didn't say that. They said, let's meet somewhere. And there's a balance here, too, where in our catechism with the eighth commandment, we say, let's take our neighbor's actions in the kindest possible way, which is good. Are there times when you have to realize other people have a sinful nature, too? And we as Christians do not need to be naive about what other people might be plotting that's evil. There's another example. So this would be before the time of Nehemiah. After Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, there was a leader in Jerusalem. Jeremiah was still there. He heard a report that someone's going to try to assassinate you. He just said, no, that can't be true. And they came and assassinated him, which wasn't good for God's people then. So are there times when a leader is going to have to understand that some threats are legitimate and you've got to make sure you stay safe? Nehemiah here knows he shouldn't be leaving Jerusalem because they could do something to him, and that would stop the whole project if they could get rid of him. What was his way of dealing with that one?
Ignoring it.
Kind of ignoring it. People do this all the time still today. What was his response? I'm too busy right now. So what do? Which his real reason is, I have a sense that you are trying to hurt me. So this is one where he just says, I'm too busy, and he keeps delaying and putting off the meeting. And that's where I do have a real respect for seasoned people who are leaders, where they do have a sense of when do you go and do something, when do you wait. There's so many different responses you could have to any situation. And Nehemiah has a sense of here's how you reply and here's what you do when you're facing opposition. So this is following right on what we read. We read verses 1 to 9. Here's verse 10. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mahabtabel, who was shut in at his home. He said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. But I said, should a man like me run away? Or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who have been trying to intimidate me. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. And that last line, it's incredibly fast, how fast Nehemiah was able to build the wall. And it's not entirely his credit. There were a lot of other people helping. But you get the sense Nehemiah was a good leader. But going back before, we've got more opposition. So what's happening this time, and what's Nehemiah's response? This time he's going to face whatever happens. What is it? Who is it that's coming to him with a warning, and what are they saying? This one's a little closer to home than a letter sent from somebody in a different area of the Persian Empire. Someone who lives in Jerusalem, who at least claims to be worshiping the same God. And so you don't have the exact words here, but it really sounds like these prophets and prophetesses were using the name of the Lord to say that God has sent me with a message to warn you. Which, if you want an example of the second commandment being broken, misusing God's name, to claim that God has said something when he hasn't would be obviously breaking the second commandment. So now you've got someone who's coming to him in the name of the true God saying, you're going to get killed, you need to go hide in the temple. Which maybe seems strange to us. I don't know if I were going to get killed that the first place I'd go would be to a church. But back then the temple was one of the most fortified buildings in Jerusalem. So when the city fell, usually the temple was about at the end. And there was a sense that you don't kill people in the temple. So when people there's the concept of finding sanctuary. That whole idea of sanctuary, the sanctuary is a name for the place where you worship, that a sanctuary is a place where you ought to be safe, that people ought not to kill somebody else in a sanctuary. So they say, go hide in the temple. Nehemiah's response to this one is to say, no, I'm not going to go. So that previous one, he'd been able to sense there was a legitimate threat in that invitation to go outside of Jerusalem. Now he's got the sense to say, this one's fake, and if I actually would take my own safety as the top priority, that's going to slow down the project, and then people are going to say he only cares about himself, and look how he just tried to stay in the temple. So now he has a sense of, actually, if I would keep myself safe now, that would hurt the people. So now I need to take the risk and just keep going, even though people say that there's a death threat against me. And again, to be able to sort all those out, you said to pray for wisdom, right, from God as you lead. Nehemiah has a sense of what's going on and how to respond to all these different people. Questions here deal with the fact, should you expect anything different today? That are there going to be times when, as you're leading people, it can happen in the Christian church too, although I'd hope that as we work together, there's a lot less of that. But as you work with other sinful people in a sinful world, that's why the word politics can be kind of a dirty word, right? That people say they're playing politics, or that there can be a lot of stuff that's not quite honest, or that's threats that people can use to try to influence others. And Nehemiah had to deal with that. So before we move to the next section, I'll just put both of them up there. So the first one is, you saw the things that people brought against Nehemiah. What are some of the things that a Christian might face today? And second question, what would you do if you're in that kind of position and you're the one who in some way is attacked?
The second one, it impressed me that Nehemiah prayed for his attackers.
He did, and where was that? Verse 14. That Nehemiah would commit this into God's hands. God, remember them and what they've done. And I think that's something I still continue to wrestle through. When is it you pray that prayer? Because we do want all people to be saved, all people to find forgiveness in God. But on the other side, the Bible says that God is going to judge the world. And that when people wrong us, it's not on us to take revenge or to get back or settle everything in this life. God will be the one who will remember in the end. And that was Nehemiah's prayer, is God, I'm putting this in your hands. Remember what they've done. Keep going. What else? What else would you say to either of those? Jill?
To the first one, it just lies, things that are not true. And I guess going to the second one with that, I guess I go back to the word respect. He respectfully said that's not true and kept on with his work rather than engaging and therefore kind of losing what he should be doing and losing focus.
So for those who couldn't hear, Jill focused on the lying. That was similarity. They had that letter that was full of lies, and still today there can be a lot of lies that are used to influence people. How as a Christian do you respond to a lie? Jill's comment was like Nehemiah, to just say that's not true and state the truth and then just keep going. That's one I don't know. And I think as a country we're really wrestling with that one right now, is how do you deal with lies in the government? And in some ways, social media and everybody being able to spread whatever they'd like to spread has compounded that problem. It's not new, it just takes different shapes in different generations. But if you're in a leadership position, how do you deal with lies is something you're going to have to know what to do. Matt?
I think at times people will twist Christianity to try and use it, quote unquote, against you. In other words, they will misinterpret or misapply scriptural truths and try to use that. And so I think...
Like Christians are pro-slavery, right?
What's that?
Christians are pro-slavery.
Yes.
Because there's slavery mentioned in the Old Testament. And
That's a classic example.
an example of, so his would be if someone takes something in the Bible and twists it to try to use it against, you must be pro-slavery because you're a Christian. They're like, no, I'm not pro-slavery because I'm a Christian. But you'll hear people who will make some crazy accusations like that. So keep going.
And so you have to be able to know the truth and then be able to boldly share the reason, the truth, and the hope we have in what it truly means. So you have to be knowledgeable, and you have to be in the Word, and you have to then be, as we talked about earlier, bold enough to be able to clearly say what is right and what is wrong and defend from the attack.
That kind of attack can come either from a very shallow understanding of the Bible or just some pretty straight up malice that they would purposely twist it. But if you take in the best way, and this is someone who doesn't know the Bible well, you'd better be able to know God's Word well enough to be able to say, that's not actually what I believe. That's not actually what the Bible says. I don't know. Or when do you just say, that's not true, and you move on? When do you try to... That can be really hard. When do you present a defense? When do you just move on? I don't know all the time. Glenn?
I would say, in addition to that, the unbeliever that does not want to believe in God, not only doesn't want to believe in God, but wants to take away your right to believe in God. It's not just that they want to be an unbeliever, they want to take away your right to be a believer. And so maybe it was that way, but I think more and more now, from what I've seen in the lifetime that I've been on, that they don't just disagree with your belief in God. They believe that they don't. They don't believe, and they want to stop you from believing. And so that is something that really you have to stand strong and pray about it. And like Matt said, that you have to really know what is right and what's right and how to articulate that.
For those who couldn't hear, Glenn said he senses that more and more people would not just like to not believe in God themselves, but to take away the right of us and others to believe in God and to just stand firm against that. And for myself, I think I see more and more that it's not about proving everybody else wrong all the time, as it is just being able to give a good defense of, here's what I believe. And not argue about everything, but to just clearly state, here's what the truth is. I read a quote. This wasn't about Christianity, but it was just about politics in general. It said, the worst thing isn't to be attacked by somebody who's skilled at attacking. The worst thing is when your cause is defended by somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. That I'd rather be attacked by somebody who's a strong attacker and then to be defended well than to have somebody who's speaking back who really doesn't know what they're talking about. So to be able to respond to people and speak the truth. Yeah, for me, that second one, to be able to resist the urge to return evil with evil, to return lies with lies, to return anger with anger. I'm concerned that I see that as a trend in our country, that people are saying it's okay if other people are angry for me to be angry. And how is it that we as Christians, we don't just lay down, we don't just roll over or say I don't care, we do make a stand, but in a way that is loving and kind and fits with our faith, that we don't fall into the trap of committing the same sins against other people that they're doing against us. That can be hard. People can say that it doesn't feel like there's a level playing field. They have all these they have all these things they can use against me. I have so few things I can use against them. But to pray to God and to pray that He'd give us ways where we can respond in love and with the truth. Let's just look at the last one briefly. So now we're jumping way ahead. Again, you could read more. In the meantime, Nehemiah went back. Again, he had a time window where he served for a time and went back. He came back a second time, and this is from later in the book, Nehemiah 13. In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, all kinds of loads. They were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What's this wicked thing you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same thing so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." When the evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them all and said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. That's kind of a refrain through the book. We didn't read all the passages that say it, but in this life of prayer with God, Nehemiah is always saying, "God, please remember me." And all these things I've stood up and done for you and for your people. What was the issue here?
They're violating the Old Testament rules regarding the Sabbath
In favor of what?
in favor of money.
Or put in a good way, it's the economy, right? Why, Nehemiah, are you putting the brakes on the economy by shutting down everything on Saturdays? And Nehemiah, he knows this is part of our worship life together. The Sabbath day is to be kept holy, so then he actually has the authority to lock the gates. Isn't that great? All these people camped outside, and he says, "I'm going to arrest you if you spend the night outside the gates." And he's able to use his power that way to try to keep the Sabbath day holy. Now, we're not a theocracy. Parts of our country have had blue laws that try to keep Sunday as a special day. I don't think you'll find pastors in our churches saying that we ought to be trying to institute more blue laws, like no alcohol sold on Sundays, or you have to close restaurants. If Chick-fil-A wants to close on Sunday, fine. How Christian that is to close things on Sunday, I guess you could argue that, but that's not going to be the tools that we have in our government today. But what is it that you can do as a leader that when you see people who are pushing against what is right, to try to react against that? This was an example from Nehemiah's life of saying we need to lock the gates on Friday nights. It's 10:02. Just to wrap up today, any thoughts from you on what was something you took away from these weeks? Something that struck you, or just as you live as both the kingdom of God, the kingdom of this world together? What's something you've taken away from all these weeks we've looked at it? Wendy?
No matter, thinking specifically of Nehemiah, no matter what side you're on, you do all to the glory of God, and Nehemiah did, that the king respected him, and whether they were on the same side religiously. So we need to, wherever we are placed in whatever profession, to do all to the glory of God. And in that, those employers will respect you and your word, and that's how you can work and make changes possibly.
Yeah, to respect and work with people even if they don't share your faith. You might have assumed that Nehemiah is going to be working with all believers. And it's obvious from the book. No, he had to deal with a lot of people who didn't share his same faith. But he's okay with that and keeps going and leading as best he can. Matt.
While we live in two kingdoms, our true home is in heaven. And so as you balance the earthly and the heavenly, the society versus the church, the Christian is a Christian living in society, not a member of society trying to be a Christian. And so as we go through and deal with the practical, the reality is all our words, all our actions should be a reflection of what we truly are, which is a member of God's church. And that may mean, while we can be part of society and express beliefs and live there, if we're going to make exceptions or move away from parts of life, we do need to make those exceptions or those changes on how we live in society. In other words, don't live fully the way society lives just because it's what society does, but rather live as a Christian in society. And when we have to make those changes to our life, don't make them be to the life, the words, the actions, the thoughts of a Christian, but rather maybe different than that of society.
For those who couldn't hear him, that was a great way to summarize a lot of stuff we've talked about. That finally we are citizens of heaven forever. And it's not that gets compartmentalized, so no matter what I do in this life, I am a Christian. And that includes when I'm in the kingdom of this world too. Everything I do is part of my life as a Christian. Jesus had that as his prayer the night before he died, about praying for us who are in the world but not of the world. And I'm praying for all of you and for me too, that we're able to live in both of those roles at the same time. Kingdom of this world and our calling as God's people too in his church. So we need to wrap up for today. Then, like usual, let's all leave and we'll sanitize the church before second service. Looking at next week, the Bible studies are going to tie in with the sermon series. So it's sowing seeds, about how just like a farmer plants seeds and then God causes it to grow, how there are promises like that as we use our resources and abilities, everything we have to plant the word of the gospel here in Lake Mills and beyond. So let's close with a prayer today. Lord, I pray today for all of us in this room, but especially for people who are yours through faith in Jesus, who also are leaders in our world, in the government. I pray that you would give them a love for people, all people, that they would carry out their responsibilities, really doing what's best for those they serve. I pray that you would give them a patience, because it can be so hard to deal with others, especially when they do things that are sinful, but give them a patience, give them too a wisdom to be able to sort out what's best in all these different circumstances, and give them a strength to stand up for what is right, even if there's opposition. So I pray all those things for us and for all those you've given us as leaders. Amen.